Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 22nd episode of the Startup Boston podcast, where I interview entrepreneurs, investors, and influencers in the Boston startup community to uncover actionable advice and stories from their experiences. I'm your host, Nick Dupuis. I want to give a big thank you to Shay Coakley, founder and CEO at Leanbox, who you can listen to in episode 8, for providing me an introduction to today's guest. Today's guest is Rob Biederman. Rob co-founded Catalant, formerly HourlyNerd, while getting his MBA at HBS as a requirement for his Field 3 course. Him and his co-founders started by going to small businesses surrounding the campus and asking what problems they were facing and how they could help. MBA students from surrounding schools would then carry out the work needed for the small businesses. Today, Catalant has over 28,000 experts on their platform and has completed projects for small companies and enterprises such as GE. Companies turn to Catalant when they have a project they need completed but don't have experts in-house capable of completing the work. Catalant experts cost a fraction of hiring a top-tier consulting firm because they remove resources who aren't necessary in solving the problems the company is facing and only include resources that are necessary for your need. In this episode, a few things Rob talks about are how freelancers on the platform are vetted, how freelancers on the platform can stand out, what drove the decision to rebrand from HourlyNerd to Catalant, the difficulties with building a two-sided marketplace, and how he sees the gig economy affecting the overall job marketplace in years to come. And if you like today's episode, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on iTunes so you can get all of my new episodes as soon as they're released right on your podcast app. And remember, you can find all show notes at startupbostonpodcast.com. Enjoy today's episode. Rob, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Before we get started, can you give us a little information about your background?
Of course. So I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of a company called Catalant, which provides the leading technology to power the future of work. We have a network of 28,000 experts that we staff at largely Fortune 1000 companies using proprietary software designed to improve outcomes. And
what were you doing before Catalant?
Yeah, so before founding the company, I actually spent my entire career in private equity, first at Goldman Sachs and then at Bain Capital. The company actually came out of a business school class project where we were really more than trying to start a company, just figuring out if there was a market need for an idea we had, which was that in 2013, back then, it felt to us that you could connect talent directly to opportunity, and that a lot of the traditional middlemen that have participated in the intermediation of talent and opportunity were out of date in a world of Skype and Dropbox and Slack and other great communication tools.
So can you give us more information about what Catalant is and what you do?
Sure. So you can think about us as the talent provider of the future, where when a company reaches a challenge or decision that they aren't well positioned to answer with their existing resources, you navigate over to gocatalant.com and you can quickly be connected with an expert who can help you solve that problem. And the projects tend to last between 4 and 6 weeks. And for our enterprise clients, they tend to cost, kind of between $10,000 and $30,000.
So what's the cost difference then between hiring a large consulting firm and hiring Catalant?
Oh, it can be as much as 10 or 100x. So wow. The shame of the large consulting firms is while they do a really good job, most of the time they're too blunt an instrument for the problem that needs to be solved. So if you call the Boston Consulting Group or Bain & Company, they'd love to help you out, but they really only offer their product as a team of 7, costing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a month. Mm. What we largely do is take away the parts of the team that are definitely smart but may not add specific value to solving your problem, and deliver you only the resources you need through technology, which keeps our costs low and allows us to offer the talent basically at cost.
So your customers, are these companies that have used consultants in the past and are now switching to this new model, or are they companies that have never used consultants in the past?
It's a great question. We actually, GE is our General Electric is our largest customer, and we've spent a lot of time understanding with them why it is that we've done so well there, and hopes to emulate it at all of our other clients. And certainly in specific cases, we've helped provide a cheaper, faster, better solution than they would have gotten with consulting. But just as often, we are solving those challenges that they really didn't know what to do before. So we're almost growing the pie for overall talent spend. And maybe on the margin, people are using us instead of a market research firm or a boutique consulting firm, or maybe even instead of making a full-time hire, because they've come to realize that they really need 6 weeks of work, not a indefinitely tenured full-time employee.
Who are the freelancers on your site?
They tend to be people, between, let's say, 30 and 45 who've opted out of the full-time workforce intentionally. So they've gotten to a point in their careers where they feel like they want the freedom and flexibility that comes with being a freelancer. But part of why they end up with us is that they want to be compensated fairly and work for the most interesting, largest companies in the world. They're people who've decided to take a very high degree of ownership in their professional lives. And we're really excited to have such a high-quality group that's actually growing by about 1,000 a month.
And it's not just MBAs on the platform anymore, right? You now have like data scientists and others on the platform. So what led to wanting to expand beyond just MBAs?
Primarily customer driven. We really have hesitated to ever build out a vertical just based on our own theorized view on demand. We really wait until clients tell us that there's some skill set or functionality that they really require. And then we responsibly will help build out that vertical. At the same time, we have lots of folks signing up on our platform every day who are not MBAs, but are really talented and may create a lot of value for our enterprise clients. And so we try to iteratively make that match between a new pool of demand meeting a pool of supply that's been onboarded and is ready to go.
How are the freelancers on your site vetted?
There's many stages in the vetting process. I think the overall principle is that we are looking for a proven track record of success on projects that are very similar to the one that you're asking them to take on. So the smartest person in the world who doesn't know how to solve your project isn't valuable to you at all. And at the same time, there may be somebody who doesn't have the most blue chip resume, but has solved precisely the question that you need help with. And so a lot of the way our software works and a lot of the client support is around structuring needs in a very precise way so that we aren't just targeting, this person is smart because they went to the Wharton school, but they did this at this company, and that's why it's relevant to doing it for you.
And how are the freelancers matched with the different companies?
So when a project gets posted, it obviously starts with 28,000 options, and then based on skill set match, opportunity availability, price, interest in the project, experience, that'll get iteratively narrowed down. So you'll start with the 28,000, but in the end, there's probably between 10 and 15 that are a good fit. And a combination of the client looking through those profiles, and sometimes with some help from a member of our team, can narrow that down to 2 or 3 people that they will schedule an interview with, and all that happens within the software. And then I think what they're really looking for is somebody who can provide a very detailed, structured plan that makes clear that they know exactly what to do. The thing that we really would never want to do is have our clients paying for folks in our network to learn. We are trying to get to really precise answers really quickly. I think that's what creates value for both sides.
So what advice would you give to a freelancer who's just starting out on your platform and they want to really be a rock star performer?
I think the most important thing is building a demonstrated track record of success. So, we see a lot of relatively blue chip people show up and start only bidding on $75,000 or $200,000 projects, and they rarely win because the user feedback matters tremendously. So if you think about it, a good analogy would be you wouldn't want to have an Uber driver take you across country in their first ride. You want to see that they'd done 10 trips in town and prove that they were a safe driver and knew how to get places and had a reasonable vehicle. And so our strongest encouragement for people is to start out, win 5 or 10 projects, do an incredible job on those, and then the larger project flow usually comes pretty quickly after that.
Do you find that sometimes people get recommended to other companies, or is it?
Yeah, there's a lot of functionality built into the site where you can refer individual consultants both within your company and then across companies. And so the core of our vetting engine is feedback from clients. People on our team don't know if these people are any good, and they aren't well positioned to do that, just don't have the resources. So nothing is more compelling to a marketing VP at a beverage company than understanding what another marketing VP at a different beverage company said about a specific person.
So you just rebranded from HourlyNerd to Catalant. Can you talk about what the driver was behind that decision?
Sure. So we, just for context, we work with about 10% of the Fortune 1000 and then thousands of individual medium and smaller businesses. The HourlyNerd branding we felt was both technically inaccurate because the projects are not priced hourly. And if you met the very talented people on our platform, you'd probably hesitate to call them nerds. It really signaled folks to a human marketplace for small businesses. And as our business has come to include more experienced experts and larger demanders, we felt that a new name that might both speak to the results you can get, and that's the catalyst part of it, as well as the underlying talent, which is the brilliant talent. You roll all of those up and you get the catalyst for brilliant talent, Catalant. As we've focused more and more on the software that's used to deploy the specific people, we felt the name that evoked less feelings of marketplace and more feelings of software provider made a lot more sense, and Catalant was a great fit there.
When you were at HBS and you started by walking around to different SMBs in the area, telling them that you were a student at HBS and that you were there to solve their problems, what were some of the reactions that you got?
By and large, the reactions were very negative. We probably went to about 500 small businesses in Cambridge and Brighton and Alston, and most of the people, saw a bunch of snot-nosed kids in suits walk in from Harvard Business School offering their help, and they were not impressed. I think a lot of what we learned in those days is that the same exact value proposition can be very differently received depending on how it's expressed. And so we're folks who worked at top consulting and investment banks, and we want to help solve your problems is a really bad way to start a conversation. But instead, asking questions, and this is, pretty basic selling that we just didn't know at the time. Like, how do you think about staffing? Or when was the last time you changed your prices? Or when do you reorder inventory? Can lead you down a much more productive conversation where then in real time you can be demonstrating value by saying, oh, well, prior to going to business school, I helped out at Outback Steakhouse corporate, and we learned that we could take this action and save this amount of money. And what I think small business owners, who are some of the most under-celebrated folks in the global economy, they work hard and they're smart, and I think historically they haven't had access to great resources. And so they're only too thrilled if you show up and you can help them out. You just have to be able to express it in a way that's relevant and timely for them.
When you were building the company, you have a two-sided marketplace where you have your freelancers and then the companies. What was that process like for building those out? Did you build one before the other, or did you build them both out at the same time?
It's always difficult with a two-sided marketplace because you have to have, when people show up on their first day, they will only come back and they'll only stick around if you can show them what they came for. And historically, marketplaces are really hard to get started, but then also really hard to disrupt for the same reason. We knew that almost all of the projects that we were talking with small businesses about, we could personally do if we needed to. And we didn't have such volume that we couldn't take them on. And so even though we've never really done too many projects, we did one or two at the beginning, we felt pretty comfortable asserting to the demand side that we had the supply, because we knew that if it came down to it, we could go get a classmate to do it or email a college friend and ask him or her to jump in. Mm-hmm. Whereas if the students showed up and there weren't projects, you probably only had one shot to get them to show up.
So you were more focused on getting those projects because you knew,
we knew we'd figured out the supply side. Indeed,
okay. Yeah. So what are some of the favorite projects that have been completed on the platform?
Yeah, I have a few personal favorites. I think a lot of my favorites speak to some part of the platform that I think is really transformational. One of them was a project for a toy OEM, for a toy manufacturer that had lost a distribution channel that it had used for 35 years to sell a given product. And, they discussed with one of the global consulting firms doing a very involved $2 million engagement over where to distribute the toy for the 2014 Christmas season. Ultimately, they chose to go with a team of folks from our site, one of whom had worked at Amazon, one of whom had worked at Walmart, and then a sort of client team leader with supply chain experience to roll up all the insights together. And I think what we ultimately proposed, the project was about $40,000, led to the earliest sellout they'd ever had. Our proposal was that they distribute the toy completely through e-commerce. And that was wildly successful, and it wasn't the answer that the global consulting firm had told them. The global consulting firm had thought about it as you're basically going to distribute through Walmart or Target. And it's just a matter of comparing the economics. And I think what was cool about our platform was we assembled a team of 3 folks who'd never met each other, still have never met each other, who worked totally remotely to deliver a innovative solution that probably wouldn't have occurred to you if you had been part of the global consulting firm's training and talent development process, which was, relatively risk averse and grounded in what they'd done historically.
So when did you start to realize that this was a viable business and that lots of other businesses needed and wanted the services that you were providing?
Yeah, early on, we did some helpful projects for true micro businesses, dry cleaners and laundromats in Boston. And we thought we were thrilled that we were creating great value and both supply and demand were having good experiences. I think we worried, though, that business might not ever be able to reach cash flows that could support its operating overhead. And through a few lucky connections from business school, we were able to get in touch with some mid-market companies, some of them in Australia, some domestically. One was a restaurant in Atlanta, a restaurant chain of 5 or 10, a startup entrepreneur who'd started a bunch of restaurants. One was a manufacturing firm in New Zealand. And for those folks, we were taking on slightly bigger projects. So they were $1,000 to $5,000. And we found upon the completion of those projects that we created tremendous value. And that there might be a chance, back then our gross margin was about 10%. And the way we forecasted it looked like it was going to be very difficult to ever break even with that. And, the feedback from the business owners was we'd be happy to pay 20% to you. You created value that we in no way other could have gotten. And so, an extra couple $100 doesn't mean that much compared to having solved this problem.
When you first started the company and at Harvard Business School, there were 6 of you, right? And now there are 3 of you. Why did you decide to stay on with the company after you graduated?
I had never had the intent to become an entrepreneur. It'd be something that I was really intimidated by. When you work in finance and you read about folks like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, you look at them and you compare them to yourself, and they look really different. They're gifted technologists and visionaries and truly creative, inspirational people. And, the average person with a normal ego doesn't really think that about themselves. And I think that the key hypothesis I'd had there was that entrepreneurship is really driven by incredible creativity and insight. And I think what I've learned since then is that it's really much more a serendipitous process of maybe even an obvious idea like this one, whose time has really come. So a lot of technologies matured right before we launched the company. Dropbox, Skype, Google Hangouts, that really facilitated us doing an idea that, easily could have existed with the appropriate technology at any point previously, but just now was only really eligible. And we happened to launch just at the time that the on-demand economy really blew up with Lyft and Uber and Postmates and TaskRabbit. And so that allowed us to get differential PR. And so why I decided to stay on was I was learning a tremendous amount, definitely failing all the time, but every day learning a little bit more about markets and testing my commercial hypotheses, usually finding that a lot of them were wrong, but it was a great learning and development process, and it's much more so now.
Do you see a shift happening in the marketplace from full-time work to on-demand freelance work?
Yeah, I think what we've observed over the last year that's really given us the confidence to raise more money and continue trying to scale this venture is that top talent, whether they're business consultants on our platform or they're really high-end graphic designers on a site like Behance, or just entrepreneurs or artists who are trying to make a living on Postmates or Uber, want to work in a different way. Talent no longer wants to be tied down to a full-time job where they have a relatively defined mandate, but instead they want their professional life to look like a series of interesting engagements and projects because they find that more interesting, and it may give them the latitude and flexibility they need to either lead a more interesting professional life or to better align the personal life they've imagined with the professional life that they need to have.
How do you see this gig economy affecting the overall job marketplace in years to come?
Yeah, I recently wrote a piece in Harvard Business Review on this topic, which is I think that the very binary nature of full-time employment creates a lot of excess fluctuations where, it may be the case that the company needs 7/10 of you or 9/10 of you. But if they're having trouble and they fall below needing 100% of you, their only option really is on or off. And there have been some innovative sort of furlough programs. But, binary employment tends to create a lot of excess volatility. And so I could honestly believe that if we're successful, you'll see a far more smooth labor market where rather than laying off 10% of workers, you idle everybody 10% and everybody keeps 9/10 of their pay, which I would propose as a better outcome for society. So I think there could be some real value in a more liquid labor market.
What is it like for you to be co-CEO? How do you split that role?
I'm very lucky to have a co-CEO and also a third co-founder who I have, tremendous trust and admiration and respect for. It certainly doesn't mean that we agree on everything all the time. In fact, we disagree on a lot. And even though we all look very similar and have very similar professional and educational backgrounds, we have very dissimilar attitudes and approaches and philosophies. And so what I think is really rich about the co-CEO experience is that the employees get two different looks. Pat tends to be very inspirational and very visionary, and I tend to be a little more practical and sort of numerically oriented. Pat tends to want to plan things and make sure everything goes really well. Now, he certainly wants to always go fast, but he tends to be very structured and rigorous. And my thought is more, let's just try something, even if it's kind of half-assed, because we'll get good data back from the market, and then we can try the second time and learn more. A lot of the arguments for a single head of a company, I think the two of us and obviously our investors would agree are a little bit out of date. So, in a world where companies look like the military, which is very much a 1950s or 60s approach, undoubtedly you probably need one single chief who makes decisions. I think as all companies, not just tech startups, become a little less sure of themselves, having a little internal, not debate society, but a group of people who can rigorously test their assumptions and hypotheses is probably more aligned with sort of like the 21st century approach to business.
How did you decide to split that role?
So Pat leads the tech and product organization, and I lead largely the sales, marketing, and client strategy organizations, and then we divide all of the other stuff, housekeeping. It was really a group decision that we reached with all of our co-founders. Pat and I hadn't thought about it much, but when we raised our first round from Mark Cuban and others, there was a request that we all have titles rather than just, a bunch of co-founders. It was probably a good development. And it was actually the other guy's idea. Pat and I didn't talk at first, and they said, the two of you each of you represents sort of like one half of the leadership of this company, both good at really different things and think about the world in a different way. And we think it'd be really special if the two of you did it together, and it's, worked out tremendously well.
So you brought up Mark Cuban, and so I want to talk a little bit about your funding. First, by congratulating you on just closing your Series C now a few weeks ago.
Thank you.
So can you tell us the Mark Cuban story and how you got Mark Cuban as an investor?
Of course, sure. So we went out to California right after our first year in business school to try to raise money from venture capitalists, and we met with 25, and they all said no. And so we were downcast. And when we got back to Boston, we were trying to rethink how it was that we would fund our company, because we knew that we needed to be able to pay engineers. None of us are able to write code. And one idea one of our co-founders had was to actually go on Shark Tank. So we applied and we got invited to audition, and then we found out that the auditions would conflict with the beginning of second year of business school. So we faced a pretty tough choice. And so we basically, decided it didn't make sense to drop out of business school just for the chance to audition on Shark Tank. And so instead we sent Mark an email directly, pretty earnest, straightforward email telling him that we'd raised most of the money for a seed round, but it was almost primarily from friends and family and from ourselves. And so we thought it might be really interesting for him to jump in. And, he wrote back very, very shortly thereafter, expressing pretty strong interest and, with a few pretty tactical questions. And so, a couple of weeks later, he wired us about $500,000. And, he's been an incredible source of guidance and support. Obviously, the guy has a lot going on, but what's incredible about him is he can jump in and with almost none of the context, immediately understand the key issues. And, he tends to be pretty directive about his points of view, which is, certainly earned the right after the business success he's had. But it's really cool. In many ways, it does look a little bit like Shark Tank, where he doesn't go for sort of pie in the sky BS. He wants revenue producing companies that have thoughtful strategies and create special value for their suppliers and for their customers. And I think that's fortunately a approach and a worldview that we largely agree with.
Why do you think he said yes when the first 25 said no? Is it like...
Yeah, I think there's some differences. One, it was just we were very early for venture capital. They don't... Some of it was just check size. Some of it was, we'd only done, I think, about $12,000 or $15,000 of revenue at that point, maybe $35,000. And so angels just tend to invest earlier in companies' trajectories, and they're willing to take on a little more risk. I think the other flip side is, when you don't have limited partners to answer to, he's obviously just investing his own money. You can tend to be willing to take slightly bigger swings because you know that if you lose your money, you don't have anybody to answer to but yourself. Whereas, VCs, if they, invest in a bad deal, they're probably going to have to talk to their LPs about it at some point. Now, obviously, they lose money on 7 out of 10 historically, so it isn't that big a concern. But Mark, I think, is able to have a lot more faith in his own convictions without having to worry about the consequences. And I think that enables him to sometimes see opportunity where other people get blocked.
So you started this company coming out of Harvard Business School during a class. And so a lot of people nowadays think that getting an MBA is no longer worth it. So I want to know why you still believe that it is.
I think a lot of the arguments I hear against an MBA tend to focus on the amount of experience you can get through work. And obviously work can be a great way to get business experience. The benefit to me of an MBA was, even though I'd worked at very high quality and thoughtful private equity firms, you never think about business dilemmas in a really academic, structured way. And so a lot of what you learn tends to be very serendipitous and role driven and less structured. And so, for example, when I got to HBS, I didn't really know very much about sales and marketing. I just had always seen them as one line in a P&L. And just the notion that there's some moments that really work for sales and some moments that really work for marketing was, believe it or not a thought I'd had, but was able to really exercise at HBS with a lot of cases on, we want to sell this shower head. What should be our channel? Who should we tell the story to? And what should be the features and benefits extolled? I think if I'd never gone to business school, I'm not sure I would have thought about those things in a very rigorous way.
What would you say was the biggest lesson you learned getting your MBA?
So, Harvard Business School is one particular type of MBA program. I think it's a pretty good one. They tend to focus a lot on the personal development stuff. Now, tremendous amount of hard skills, but for me, a lot of the most important lessons I took away from business school were largely around managing yourself and thinking about your own career. Just being authentic, which I think a lot of folks can feel like there's a certain way that they're supposed to act if they're the CEO or if they're a direct report or if they're talking to their board. And so you can actually end up driving yourself crazy and potentially being unhappy a lot if you're trying to play the role or act in a way that you think is expected of you. And I think one of the things that's best about HBS is that it says that the people who tend to get the best outcomes are the ones who just act like themselves. You want to be professional, of course, and understand context, but a lot of leaders of companies that didn't go to business school, I think, tend to be super aloof and professional, even if they're actually really down-to-earth, nice people, because they think that the leader of the company should be that way. Mm-hmm. And business school does a very good job of explaining to you that you'll only be happy and comfortable and resonate with your colleagues if you're yourself, which seems obvious if you went to nursery school, but something gets lost along the way.
What were some of the other ideas that you guys had for your class, for your business?
So an idea that my co-founder, Pat, co-CEO, was very excited about was something called nose bags, which was like a Gore-Tex sock for your nose, which would loop over on your ears with some straps, and you'd wear sort of in the situation when you'd wear a hat and gloves mm-hmm. to keep your nose warm. And it sounds like a joke, but it was actually very serious, unfortunately. And then, I think the other guys on the team wanted to do that because they thought it'd be entertaining. And at the very least, if our company fell, we'd walk away with some cool swag. And while I actually, living in Boston, often find myself needing a nose bag, I think there's a difference between a good, useful product and a sustainable company. And the reason I was so excited about a business that was at that point called HourlyNerd, it's now Catalant, was because I felt like there was the real opportunity to build a great business there, not just have a single product that could sell a bunch.
Is that what you used to sell them on this idea instead of going that route?
I don't remember. I think I wasn't, I was a lot younger then. I just kind of was annoyed and had a little bit of like a hissy fit. And, they all, when you're doing a business school class project, it's not your immediate inclination that it's going to become your job and a company worth, a reasonable amount of money, that you tend to be a little bit more, hey, this is an exercise. And so we can learn just as much about starting a business from Nosebags as we can from Rent a Nerd. So why would we go to all the trouble of Rent a Nerd?
And as a part of the class, you're given $5,000 to help start the business. Do you remember what you spent that $5,000 on?
Yeah, we spent about $10 for our first website on GoDaddy. We actually used the GoDaddy website builder tool. We printed a bunch of things called Nerdy Bucks, which were like little advertising posters that look like big $100 bills that are very silly looking. We spent a few $1,000s on a freelance PR professional, and then towards the end of the class, we spent our last $900 on our first website, our first functional website from a company called Odesk, which is now part of Upwork.
Now I want to move into our rapid fire questions. So rapid fire questions, not necessarily rapid fire answers. So what's another startup in Boston you're most excited about?
I think the guys at Insight Square do an incredible job. It's a product that's created a tremendous amount of value for us. For most companies with clients, your CRM, your customer contact software is a key part of how you operate. And Insight Squared, particularly with Salesforce, creates a lot of value for folks. There's another company called Cuvée, which is almost like the Nespresso of wine.
Okay. How do you spell that?
It's I believe it's Kuvee.
Okay.
It's actually right next door to our old office, and the founder there is a technologist who just happened to really like wine, and he found that he and his wife couldn't agree on a color. So he really liked red, she really liked white, and they would have a very hard time because neither one wanted to have a full bottle of themselves, but they both wanted the one they wanted. And so this allows you to keep a bunch of wines completely fresh using some pretty cool technology that they're actually not only testing, but actually building over in downtown Crossing, which is kind of cool. There's like real manufacturing going on right in the middle of the city.
Wow, that's really cool. What are some of your favorite tools that make your work and life easier?
We added Slack as a company a few months ago, and I've really enjoyed using it. It's definitely a fun, interesting user experience, and I enjoy the embedded what I believe is Jiffy functionality. Some people call it Giphy.
Giphy.
We have a Sonos in the office, and I actually have it at home too, and that makes the workday a lot more fun.
Yeah.
The ability for any employee just to kind of change the song at once. Everybody has a closing song, so if a project closes, that they help work on, their song plays, and so it creates with almost no wiring right out of the box, you have a fantastic product. And it's another company that's I don't know if they're doing manufacturing in Boston, but they're based right over in Cambridge.
What's some advice that you would give to your 20-year-old self?
When I was 20, I'm turning 30 in a few months, so this is almost exactly 10 years ago. I was very nervous about my career. I felt like it's largely, part of the pre-Lehman Brothers era before the crisis. You felt like if you weren't getting a job in finance, then somebody else was, and you'd be a failure because all the great people worked in investment banking. And I think that was a very short-sighted sort of like a 2006 orientation, which I'm happy that the world has moved away from a little bit, because I think there's lots of really interesting jobs out there, some of which could be at investment banks. But what's important is to find one that you really like. And I think I was very stressed about getting the right kind of job more than one that necessarily was right for me.
What's something about you that most people don't know?
Actually, a very avid mountain climber. My dad and I have, there's 48 mountains over 4,000 feet in New Hampshire. My dad's climbed 47 of them, and I've done, as of last weekend, 35. It's sometimes I don't necessarily feel this way on the way up, but it's incredible to start at the bottom of something that looks really tall and, maybe several thousand feet above you, and then find that if you just put, one foot in front of the other, you can accomplish something pretty great in only a couple hours.
Which ones are some of your favorite?
So I really enjoyed the ridge trails. So there's a couple. What we used to do is we'd go up on Friday nights and sleep in the hut. So we'd hike with headlamps for 2 or 3 hours on a Friday night, and then do the ridge on most of Saturday. So the Galehead hut leads to a pretty cool ridge that ends with some pretty incredible panoramic overviews. Mount Washington was a bear. I think I was about 11. And when we got to the top, I saw that there was a cog railway, and I was just so tired that I told my dad I wanted to take the cog railway down, and he said that was stupid. And then eventually he relented because I just refused to walk another foot. And then we found out that it was $35. And I said, oh, there's no way I want to do it. If that's the case, I'll walk down to save the money. And he said, we've already had this whole argument. It's too late now. And then we found out that if you don't not only go up, which I did, you have to also go down to get credit for it. And so I actually lost credit for Washington when we took the cog railway down. And so now I have to go back and get that one. So I went from 36 to 35. Yeah.
I did the Franconia Notch Ridge Trail last year.
Yeah, I mean, Mount Moosilauke is also a great one. It's the ratio of effort to reward is very favorable.
Do you have any favorite blogs or books?
Yeah, for sure. I think 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel is a great book. The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz.
Yeah,
we tend to really internalize a lot of the lessons from the Challenger sale and the Challenger customer here, which are both. In general, we have a dim view of sales books, but if a sales book has data that feeds it, another one on that is the Sales Acceleration Formula by Mark Roberge, who's an advisor here, ran sales at HubSpot for a long time. I think we tend to focus on empirical theory a little bit more, empirical data more than theory. And so when you have somebody like Mark, who was, in my point of view, one of the top practitioners in the SaaS sales field, takes the time to write a book that's really driven by his data experience, it's something that's worth reading.
Just a few more questions here to close out. Where can people find out more about Catalant?
It's at gocatalant.com.
All right. Where can people connect with you online?
So my Twitter is Biederman Rob, Biederman Rob, and our company at Twitter is also GoCatalant.
Do you have any parting thoughts, advice, or suggestions for the audience?
No, I think the most important thing if you want to start a company, which if I hadn't had to do it as part of a class project, I think would have been incredibly intimidating, is to get a product in the market as soon as possible, even if it isn't perfect. And you will find over time that customers and maybe suppliers tell you all that you need to know, rather than you sitting in a windowless conference room and thinking about your product roadmap. You can actually get really high value feedback from people, and that'll be more valuable than anything you could possibly think. But you also have to, at the same time, ignore I just want a faster horse and carriage problem that would have probably led to no automobile if it hadn't been ignored.
Rob, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
If you liked today's episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. You'll get all my new episodes as soon as they're released right on your podcast app. And if you really liked today's episode, it would mean a lot to me if you could write a review of the podcast as well. Just go to startupbostonpodcast.com/iTunes. And remember, you can find all show notes with links at startupbostonpodcast.com. Until next time, if you have any feedback, ideas for guests, or just want to say hi, you can reach me at nic@startupbostonpodcast.com. Or reach out on Twitter at startupbosscast. That's startup BOS cast. Cheers.